Hello, welcome to today's webinar. We are happy to have you with us for this session, Codes and Policies to Advance Zero Goals, Policies for Retrofits and New Construction. I am Connie Umphris, Communications Manager here at New Buildings Institute. This is a Best of the Forum webinar highlighting one of the 2019 Getting to Zero Forum sessions and topics given high marks in the Forum follow-up survey. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping things to tell you about. First, you are muted and we cannot hear you. This helps keep the background noise down so that everyone can better hear the speakers. I want to direct you to the dashboard that you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're having technical difficulties and cannot see the slides or hear our speakers, you can use the question pane in this dashboard to let us know and we will help you as we go. We will take a few questions at the end of the presentation. Please ask questions in the same question pane. Please take a moment to answer the survey at the end of the webinar. We consider your input in the planning of future sessions. If you are seeking AIA credits, the survey, the survey is where you will submit your, share your AIA number for credit submission. This session is being recorded. All registrants will receive an email tomorrow with links to the recording and slides for the session. If you need a certificate, it will also be part of tomorrow's follow-up. Speaking of AIA credits, learning objectives for this session are there for you to read. You may not know us here at NBI. We are a nonprofit organization working for better buildings that achieve zero energy, zero carbon, and beyond through research, policy guidance, and market transformation. The 2021 Getting to Zero Forum will again be co-hosted by NBI and Rocky Mountain Institute. For 2021, we will be in New York City. We welcome NYSERDA as a local host. We are currently accepting submissions for our call for speakers. Deadline is just under a month away. Get those submissions in. I want to take a moment to introduce our panelist. Micah Lang is a senior green building planner for the City of Vancouver. In his current role, Micah is leading the development of deep carbon reduction policies and programs for existing buildings with a focus on multifamily and commercial. Greg Hale is the Senior Advisor for Energy Efficiency Markets and Finance for NYSERDA. His work includes strategic leadership for Retrofit New York, an initiative aimed at developing scalable existing building retrofit solutions that achieve or approach net zero energy, as well as overseeing the integration of all NYSERDA net zero initiatives. Cami Peterson is the Director of Clean Energy at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, the public regional planning agency that serves the 101 cities and towns of Metro Boston. Cami oversees MPAC's clean energy work, including local energy, climate, and net zero planning, and local and state climate and energy policy. Katrina Manigan leads the buildings team within Denver's climate team in the Department of Public Health and Environment. Through Energize Denver initiative, she ensures Denver achieves its climate goals for buildings, including that all new buildings are net zero energy by 2035. Micah, over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and afternoon. I'm really happy to speak with you today. After setting the stage and getting you warmed up a bit, which is my role for this webinar, we'll head east to New York City, where we'll hear from Greg Hill at NYSERDA, and this is a state agency that I think is doing some of the most innovative work on low carbon buildings in North America. We're going to then head up and hear about regional scale holistic planning and collective action from Cami Peterson in Boston. This is a model that I'm quite interested in and have drawn some lessons for our own regional local government here in Vancouver. And then finally over to the Mile High city of Denver, where Katrina is going to share some of the details of Denver's playbook for new and existing buildings, including an update on their Climate Action Advisory Task Force. So we're really getting a nice sampling of some of the leading practices across the space of codes and standards in North America over the course of this hour. And so we're here to discuss the actions that state, regional, and local governments are taking through codes and policies to achieve net zero energy and zero carbon buildings, just like we did in Oakland 8 months ago. But a lot has changed since then. And we can't really have the same conversation. And it actually feels wrong to have exactly the same conversation. When Connie at NBI contacted us 2 months ago to ask if we'd like to do this session, I didn't know if I would have a job or if I would be redeployed to our emergency operations center, or what would even be happening in the world. Here in the city I live in, 20% of our city's workforce has been laid off, another 20% put on furlough. We have a $180 million operating deficit. You know, local governments are struggling across North America. They're on the front lines of action for green buildings and the front lines of response to crises. And so as we struggle to make decisions to keep ourselves, our families, and communities healthy, and we look for opportunities to undo structural racism that pervades our institutions and put climate equity and climate justice front and center in our policy agendas, the four of us are going to offer you a few rough ideas and reflections on why zero carbon buildings matter today more than ever, how to incorporate equity into zero carbon buildings policy, and also to not let this work get pushed down the road or derailed.
Just click into the window there, Micah.
There we go. So I'd like to acknowledge that the land I live on and work on is in the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. This is a statement that we like to read out here. It seems particularly salient in the climate that we work in today, and also to acknowledge that, you know, I work for a city government that has fomented and still perpetuates today racist policies that result in some of the most glaring inequalities in any North American community. And the city's zoning and development bylaw is at the heart of this, and I work in the planning department, which is the architect and keeper of these policies and regulations. This is important context. And so we are in a state of multiple emergencies right now. We're living in a global pandemic. There's racial justice inequities, and at the same time, wokeness that's occurring. And of course, we have a climate emergency. And I know wokeness is a bit of a controversial term, and I used it intentionally here as I really believe there needs to be a shift in consciousness to catalyze the change that is required to address the climate emergency. You know, 1,300 local governments and state governments around the world have declared a state of climate emergency, and that shift in consciousness is taking place. This is necessary because the current systems that we have either lead to dead ends, they're racist, or they're broken, or both. And two quick examples of that: replacing, you know, a 70% efficient fossil gas burning boiler with a 98% efficient fossil gas burning boiler is a dead end. And that's what most programs are still promoting today. And, you know, building high density affordable housing on major arterials that overheat in the summer without providing HRVs or HEPA filters or active cooling, in most communities, that's a pretty racist practice. And so it's up to us in government and industry to identify and call out and address head-on these unsustainable and inequitable practices, and make sure that climate justice and equity is front and center in our buildings policies. Now, this is the part where we're going to get a little bit warmed up for our main presenters. And so here, I wanted to give you a quick update on what we're doing in Vancouver, which I think is, we're trying to set the bar for others and be leaders in this space. First of all, 6 years ago, alarmed by the ineffectiveness of our own previous policies that were using a percent better than ASHRAE 90.1, and depending on LEED certification to get GHG reductions, we realized that wasn't happening. Looked elsewhere, were inspired by Brussels. We created the zero emission building plan and set the target that all new buildings would be zero carbon in their operations by 2025. And then second, There's more than just the US presidential election happening this November. Also pretty exciting is we're bringing a package to our city council, zero emission building retrofit plan that's going to set greenhouse gas limits for existing buildings, which we're hoping will achieve a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. And quickly on the new building front, how is this working? We've reduced the GHG emission intensity of multifamily buildings 75% over 6 years, which is mandated in code. And we've gone from having a single passive house in our city to 75 buildings, more than 3,600 dwelling units, 4.8 million square feet of passive house and zero carbon buildings that are either constructed, under construction, or in the development approvals process through a combination of incentives and working with leaders in the space. So this work is happening. I think there's a lot to be inspired by, and I'm really excited to turn it over to the other presenters now. Greg, I'll pass the baton to you to talk about what NYSERD is up to.
Okay, thank you, Micah. I'm working on my technology here. There we go. Looks like we can. There. Okay. Yeah. So thanks, Micah. Thanks everybody for tuning in. And yeah, I won't go over that again. But so much has changed since we did this panel in just October of last year. So we'll get to that in the presentation here. Anybody who does not know NYSERDA, New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, the New York State's energy office, and we think of ourselves as their clean energy office. We're 100% in on focusing on carbon reduction as we innovate the energy economy in New York State. So I like to start off with this slide, and I have for a while. This was in my presentation last time. In case anybody needs to remember why it's important that we're doing what we are doing. And I also think it's really interesting that this statement was before COVID. And I think it gives us a chance to think about COVID in a different way. Now there is kind of a documented historic precedent for massive worldwide change to deal with a crisis, a worldwide crisis. And imagine if we could get the same, in parentheses, relatively coordinated, but the same coordinated global response that we've seen for the COVID crisis applied to climate. And I like to think about it in two different ways. One is that, yeah, the disruption caused by COVID and the tragedy and the loss has been massive. But when you think about it, if climate change is left unmitigated, it's going to be orders of magnitudes worse than what we're seeing from COVID. So the scale of the pending disaster is much larger. The good news is that the response is 180 degrees opposite, right? So the response to COVID is everybody go back in your house, go back in your cave, retract, retrench, and it's this huge economic retraction. Whereas the response to climate, while yes, it will be disruptive and there will be winners and losers, on net, it's going to be a massive economic growth opportunity. So just bear that in mind, that there are precedents for attacking the climate crisis in history. And the second one is think about the 30 years between 1920 and 1950, when the developed world basically went through the Industrial Revolution, fought the Second World War, nationalized as needed to to meet the war effort and mobilized, essentially changed the fabric of society, and did it without computers. You know, slide rules were the calculation tool. So I'd never want to hear that we can't do it. What we need is a political will. And what we clearly don't have is the political will coming from Washington, D.C. right now, but we do have it coming from states and local jurisdictions. So it's so important for us all to keep working on this and establish the models that the rest of the world can follow. So what New York State did last year in the summer, and then it was signed into law in the fall by Governor Cuomo, was pass the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, CLCPA. This was a very aggressive piece of climate legislation, among the most aggressive of major economies in the world. The end result is calling for a carbon neutral economy by the middle of this century. And that's with specific goals set for an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The other, that's a floor, the other 15% would be through offsets. And on the way there, 40% reduction in GHG emissions by 2030. And then really important is the carbon-free electric grid. So by 2040, the legislation requires 100% clean grid, and on the way to that, a grid that's powered 70% by renewable energy by 2030. And that's, of course, super important because building electrification is only as effective in decarbonizing society as your grid is clean. CLCPA also had specific earmarks or milestones for specific technologies. It codified our new greatly expanded energy efficiency program called New Efficiency New York, which is really tripling our energy efficiency goals by 2025. Only puts us a little way toward our final goal, though. So it's a great first step. Got a long way left to go. Also dramatically increasing our goals for PV, rooftop PV, 6,000 megawatts by 2025, energy storage, 3,000 megawatts by 2030, and then a large offshore wind goal of 9,000 megawatts by 2035. And then at the bottom of the slide here talks about requirements for disadvantaged communities, and I'm going to talk about in a minute. The legislation sets up a climate action council, which is the organizing body to make this all happen. Hold on one second here. So you have this Climate Action Council. It's co-led by NYSERDA and our Department of Environmental Conservation, and it sets up a number of advisory panels. The most important for us is housing and energy efficiency, which actually is not just it's energy efficiency, the housing sector, and also energy efficiency in other sectors. A couple of other important pieces of it. It sets up a just transition working group and a climate justice working group. The law specifically requires that a floor of 35% and a target of 40% of the overall benefits of state spending on this clean energy transition go to the benefit of disadvantaged communities. So there are a bunch of words in there that need to be defined, fleshed out. What's a disadvantaged community? That's the goal of this climate justice working group. There's another working group called the Environmental Justice Working Group that is formed under a sister law that will be focusing on what are the benefits, what does it mean, the benefits of clean energy spending, and integrating the benefits into the scoping plan that's developed by the Climate Action Council. The Council is required to have its scoping plan done by January 1st of 2022. That's only 18 months away, so they've got their work cut out for them. But I think it's really important for us, and we have an advantage here in today's burgeoning social justice crisis. And I live in New York City in Greenwich Village, so I see marches all of the time. It is a true systemic crisis, like Micah mentioned, but we already have a framework here, and we just need to dive right in and enact the policies that will get us to a clean energy future, as well as elevating the importance of the environmental justice aspect of this. Sorry, there we go. Not sure what happened to that slide, but what it says in the way I put it in is that this is the same time that we did that New York City passed its Climate Mobilization Act last year, which includes the most famous part of it is Local Law 97, which does have a greenhouse gas emissions cap on all buildings over 25,000 square feet. And that cap, first compliance period 2024, next one 2030, and then it steps down every 5 years to 2050. And it's really a task to try to figure out how to align the state and the city policies there. But they're both driving at a carbon neutral building stock. So either way, we need our entire building stock to be carbon neutral by 2050. So what does it mean to have a carbon neutral building? We are defining that and figuring out metrics in our roadmap. And it's not just using, decarbonizing your on-site energy services, so don't burn fossil fuels in your building. Get the balance of your electricity from a clean grid. But are you done there? Not really, because if you just do that with the existing state of our building stock, you would wind up really overtaxing the grid, creating a winter peak that is way above what the summer peak is today and very expensive to capture. So we also need to focus on energy efficiency, deep efficiency, and real-time response to grid conditions. So grid interactivity, being able to manage your load so that you can shift your load to reduce peak demand. So again, that is just sort of a visualization of that. The buildings are only part of the system for a clean energy economy, and we really need to figure out how they interact with the grid. How can buildings serve as essentially a massive battery for the grid, and then working in vehicle charging, potentially using electric vehicle batteries as part of that system to be able to back up your buildings and to work on the grid. So the roadmap is going to do a number of things. It's a living document. This is the first iteration. We're looking for a vision for 2050. We're looking for concrete steps we can take in the next 5-10 years as well. There's a bunch of research that's going into this as we model out various pathways. We're starting with 4 building typologies in this iteration. I'll get to those in the next slide. We've had a robust stakeholder engagement process. We've run, I think, 14 different stakeholder events with experts from around the country providing input to us to educate us for the roadmap. We need to send a market signal. So if you're building a building today or doing a substantial renovation of a building today and you're not taking account of carbon neutrality, decarbonization, then you're essentially building something that will be obsolete in 5 or 10 years. So we're really trying to get the market's attention also to the benefits of carbon neutrality beyond the energy savings, primarily, a big one, the health, comfort, productivity benefits, trying to quantify those, help owners and the society understand the additional benefits that come along, and also resilience, such an important part of the world with climate change today. So there's a bunch of study on technology, cost compression opportunities. That's a big focal point. How do we make it less expensive to make this transition? And then eventually, if the roadmap will feed into the Climate Action Council, help them develop their economy-wide scoping plan. So the 4 sectors we're starting with are single-family residential, multifamily, office, both of those more in the low and mid-rise categories versus skyscrapers on this iteration, and then higher education, dorms, and classroom buildings. We got to cover new construction. A lot of it is about codes. We have developed a stretch code at NYSERDA that New York City just adopted, so that's exciting. And we a little behind Vancouver, but looking to get to net zero codes by 2030. And then we've got to figure out existing buildings. We've got at least 3/4, if not 80–85% of the buildings that will be there in 2050 already exist today. So we've got to figure out what we do with existing buildings, develop plans that can be either a comprehensive retrofit or phased capital plans where you follow a path as your equipment reaches the end of its useful life, so that at the end of, say, a 10-year period, you've gotten to carbon neutrality. So lots of stuff in our roadmap. My team lets me put this many words on a slide if I do the tiles, so there, I've done the tiles. But not just definitions and metrics, but a lot of that. So the business case is really important. What's the value proposition? Building electrification is going to be a central element. So much so that we have a second roadmap I'll talk about in 1 second. What are the pathways for these priority sectors? Where do we start? What can we do in the next 5–10 years? What are policy options that will drive the work forward faster? What are the technologies that are there? What's coming on the technology? And then what's next? What are the future research needs? As I said, this is a living document. We expect to put out addenda every 5 years or so. So now we can say, okay, well, what don't we know? And what do we need to find out to be as effective as we can be moving toward decarbonization? I won't spend a lot of time on the schedule because it always slips, but right now we're looking to finish our first draft by end of July, sometime in August, take out a presentation of this first draft to a broader stakeholder, basically the entire stakeholder community in the state, get comments back, edit, compile some more research into the final draft, which we would like to publish at the end of the first quarter of 2021. So as I mentioned, we have decided that we need a building electrification roadmap as well. Building electrification is a critical element of decarbonization. I think everybody probably understands that. The building electrification roadmap itself is looking at a bit of a shorter time horizon. So they aren't really thinking about 2050 in the building electrification roadmap, but more as a 10-year view into where we need to be on the electrification front in by 2030. Where we are today, what are the gaps, what are the technologies, what are the policy options to help us get there. So that's the elements of the building electrification slide. So I don't have time to get into programs. We got some interesting programs already launched, not waiting for the roadmaps to be completed, but Retrofit New York is focusing on net zero panelized retrofit projects. Really exciting prefabricated evolution of the construction market, and then buildings of excellence also based off a Brussels foundation, their exemplary buildings competition, and this one is about net zero buildings. We've run through 2 rounds now and have another round that will happen next year. The second round of submissions are in. Announcements will be made in the fall. Lots of exciting projects from that. So with that, I will turn it over to Cami.
Thanks, Greg, and hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm going to see if I can make my technology work, which always somewhat of a challenge. Ooh, I think I did that. Okay, good sign. And I apologize. Oh, and it's moving very quickly ahead. Hold on. Let's see if we can back up a minute there. Okay. And hopefully you all can hear me all right as we go. They've decided apparently to tunnel under the earth at my neighbor's house next door, starting sometime in the last 20 minutes. Quiet for the moment, but fingers crossed that they let us have some moments of peace here. My name again is Cami Peterson. I'm the Director of Clean Energy for the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. As Connie said in the beginning, we are a regional planning agency. See if it feels like moving forward here. Try that again. All right, well, sure by the time it actually feels like responding, it'll have moved me much too far forward. There we go. Yeah, I'll try to back up, but I'll keep going. So we are a public agency. We were created by the legislature a little over 50 years ago. We are a mission-based public agency, really striving towards smart growth, sustainability, equity, and regional coordination. And we serve the 101 cities and towns of Metro Boston. It's about half the state's population and 2/3 of the state's jobs. Okay. Let's see. Sorry for all the slide movement. In clean energy, we work on energy efficiency, renewable energy, climate mitigation, and climate resilience. And we do that work with individual cities and towns. We do it regionally with multi-municipal projects, and we do it across the state. And we do our work with planning, with programming, program implementation, and on policy. So this slide was up for a minute before, but just to tell you why I have it in here. So the statewide frame for the work that's being done in Massachusetts really was set a good 12 plus years ago. So Massachusetts has always liked to pioneer in the climate space and be one of the leaders in the country. And we pride ourselves on that. And the Global Warming Solutions Act set forth the benchmark for that for us back then by committing us to 80% reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions below the 1990 level by 2050 and 25% by 2020. So we're nearing in on that goal. And that really has, like I said, kind of set the framework by which many of our cities and towns and regional organizations are committing our work. And I would say it was informed by appetite and pressure from those cities and towns as well, that the cities and towns here in Massachusetts and I would say across the country and the world have really been leaders in the climate space. And so what we've been doing then at the more jurisdictional level is focusing on how we can help our cities and towns and those regions to move forward. Let's see if I can actually go to the slide I want here. No. I'm going to try to go back to that equity slide, but the reason I put that up and had it at this point is because it is a lens that we've been trying to apply to all of our work, and especially to our climate work, and is a way that we use to think about the considerations that we want to take into account. And so I would ask all of you to also to bring that frame of making sure that you are, bringing to the table, asking questions of those communities that will be most impacted and that are most vulnerable, that you are considering environmental justice communities in your decision making, how heat and flooding and other things might impact your projects and your decisions. I don't know how I got that laser pointer piece up there. Let's see if I can just get it to go back to the slide that I want. Sorry, bear with me for just a second.
Cami, would you like me to just take over the slides?
If you're able to, that would be great. It does not seem to be responding very nimbly to me.
That's
and I was
fine.
hoping just to, I was on the equity slide, but we can move to the one right after that.
Right there?
Actually, you can go forward to the next one.
Okay.
Great.
You just tell me next
and
I'll advance for you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Connie. So we have brought that lens and the work that we've been doing and the state's mandates to our Metro Mayors Coalition. And that's a group of 15 cities and towns in the inner core of Greater Boston. You can see the map roughly here. And we've been working with that coalition of mayors and managers and their staff for years. But in 2015, they really felt moved to start working together much more expressly on preparing for climate change. And a year later, put forth a really pioneering commitment to be net zero as a region by 2050. And at the time, it was the first kind of regional commitment to 2050 like that we knew of. And so these priorities that you see listed here continue to be front and center for that task force, but we've also been working very hard together on climate mitigation toward net zero. And you can go on to the next slide, Connie. a year after that commitment, MAPC launched its net zero planning resources. And so we've been doing work, like I mentioned, in clean energy and climate for a while, but really wanted to focus that work around a holistic climate planning framework. And so that's what you see here. We've been putting together a municipal net zero playbook for our cities and towns that really focuses on this comprehensive view of how you go about net zero planning and the benefits that can come from that. So a lot of the strategies you've heard my colleagues here talk about, you can bring about economic benefits, public health benefits, and air quality, ecological benefits. Hopefully you're doing it in the right way so that you're getting much more equitable outcomes, really affecting equity positively and improving quality of life. You can go on to that next slide. And we've released already our framework for equity and our framework for action out of our municipal net zero playbook, and more chapters on the different sectors and strategies will be coming out this year. A lot of that focuses on collective action. There's obviously a lot cities and towns can do individually, and a lot of the strategies talk about that, but there's so much that can be benefited by working together. Economies of scale, knowledge sharing, technology transfer, not having to recreate the wheel, sharing administrative burdens. You can go on to the next slide. So that's one of the big themes that we bring to this work as well. Other things you'll see in the playbook are LED streetlight work. A big bang for your buck that any of your cities and towns can be doing is retrofitting their streetlights to LEDs. Next slide. We've also, if you're able to in your states, you can work on community choice aggregation. And in our region, we've called it green municipal aggregation. It's been one of the most effective strategies just by adding additional renewable energy into the community-wide electricity supply. Here with these communities that MAPC works with directly, and there's more throughout the state, but by adding just an additional 5 percentage points of renewable energy into their electricity supplies, they've created demand for over 28 megawatts of new wind on the electricity grid annually. So really impactful types of strategies, and you can go on to the next slide, that we're trying to put together, package together in the playbook. But today we're mostly focusing on buildings, and the reason for that, besides this being an NBI webinar, is the outsized impact that they really have on many city and town greenhouse gas inventories. So for many of our cities and towns in Metro Boston, which are generally relatively densely populated areas, buildings can make up 70, 80% of a greenhouse gas emissions profile. So it makes a really big difference if we decarbonize our buildings in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions overall and getting to be a net zero community. You can go to the next slide. So as we've been looking at that, there's multiple levers that you can push and pull to make that happen. In Massachusetts, there's a number of ways that you can look to impact buildings and building regulations. A number of them have to do with code. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that today, but many of you have probably also been involved in the International Energy Conservation Code. The 2021 IECC vote just happened at the end of 2019. That is the basis of the Massachusetts statewide base building code. We have one universal code. Cities and towns cannot have their own building code here in Massachusetts. You can opt up as a city or town into our stretch energy code. And so over 3/4 of cities and towns in Massachusetts have done that. But otherwise, you are part of the base code, and that still informs much of what is in the stretch code. So that IECC makes a big difference here. And if those that don't know want more information on where we are in the IECC, I encourage you to reach out to your friends at NBI and other partners. We've been working on this a lot with our cities and towns, many of them who participated in the 2021 vote. And it is still going through an appeals process as many of the most efficient provisions that were adopted by a majority of voters are being challenged. So I encourage you to plug into that if you haven't been following that very closely. But more, I want to spend some time, just another couple of minutes on our local ordinances and our zoning here. So you can go on to the next slide. And this just shows a couple of the ways that cities and towns have been working on this locally. So things like resolutions and commitments, especially to lead by example in municipal buildings, and making sure that those are green and have zero energy. Some of our bigger cities like Boston and Cambridge, looking at building energy use disclosure ordinances, they've passed those a few years ago, really enables them to get more insight into their largest buildings, which are responsible for the most emissions, and kind of urge them and bring them along to decarbonizing. And go on to the next slide. And we think there's a lot of opportunity in zoning. And so we kind of coined the term climate zoning and have been encouraging cities and towns to think about how they can use their zoning, which they have the most impact over and are accountable for, responsible for, to see what they can do to really enable climate smart technologies, net zero enabling technologies and systems. So the one I like to point to as an example is my first bullet here, really seemingly kind of simple thing. If you could exempt from setback requirements Things like building envelope, for extra insulation and making those really robust envelopes, for equipment, for air source heat pumps, for height requirements, if you can exempt things like the solar panels and solar thermal collectors and allow for those to not cut into the living space that you otherwise would have to do, then you're accommodating, incentivizing, encouraging more climate forward types of technologies, those types of things we need for our buildings to get to net zero. You can go on to the next slide. And so there's a lot that can kind of be done without going through a full zoning overhaul, which I know is very time consuming and tricky, though. I encourage you to look at your zoning comprehensively too, but to really kind of get at some of these enabling types of zoning provisions. Here's one example of an ordinance that Watertown, in town here in Massachusetts, back in the end of 2018 adopted. This is really the first of its kind in Massachusetts, where they're requiring solar, and you see its projects over 10,000 square feet, 10 or more residential units, so a good number of their buildings that are being affected by this. And there's still conversation here in Massachusetts, debate whether this conflicts with the building code, but currently it still stands and is something that other cities and towns are trying to emulate. You can go on to the next slide. And so, what other types of things can we do? We're but also encouraging cities and towns to think about their rooftops. That's a lot of space there that can be used in more multi-benefit ways, especially if you think about in new construction, making your roofs strategic so that they're not littered with different equipment, but rather that you have room to kind of use those spaces for other good uses. So you could require, any number of these types of things. You could prescribe it, or you could have it be that it depends on the owner. It depends on the orientation, but really there's a lot of benefits that can come from reducing heat load, reducing stormwater runoff, reducing wind load, for generating electricity or heat in some cases. So that's a requirement that we think could be really useful. On to the next slide. You can also think about by right. Another place where you can really enable these types of ultra-low emission systems is by simply just require them or allowing them to be adopted by right rather than having to go through a special permit process. And so by just creating these more streamlined pathways, you can encourage any number of systems that might have just had more hurdles attached to them otherwise and make that an easier path for developers rather than comparable or harder. Next slide. We do also encourage you to think really comprehensively. So, another kind of route to take, and if you are a city or town that has, a zone of your community that will have a lot of new construction, then we encourage you to kind of think of, is there a climate overlay zone on which you can lay the chance to add a lot of different mechanisms. And you could have a large menu like this, or you could kind of, narrow it down or prescribe certain measures be taken. The flexibility here might be exciting, and to really kind of think again holistically about using your open space, your transportation, your connectivity, encouraging biking, walking, the public health benefits, and all that we can do in buildings and with energy sources. So I'll stop there. Apologies for the technical difficulties, and thank you again for having me today. And over to Katrina.
Hi, everyone. This is Katrina Manigan. I'm, as Connie said, the buildings team lead for our new Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. I'm so thankful for your time today. Thank you to the New Buildings Institute for having us and for the great presentations ahead of me. I want to tell you what we are doing in Denver to work to solve climate change in buildings. So if you can go to the next slide. First, I'll talk a little bit about our work in existing buildings and homes. I want you to understand Denver's building stock a little bit better first and our greenhouse gas emissions. So homes and buildings are accounting for 63% of Denver's greenhouse gas emissions. The next slide. We know that those are made up of multifamily buildings, offices, hotels, municipal and K-12 schools, warehouses. Next slide. Our goal, and of those 82% of the buildings are 82% of the emissions and the square footage are 3,000 large buildings. And then we have 18% of the buildings that are in the square footage that come in 14,000 small buildings. So we both need to tackle energy efficiency and climate solutions and electrification in large and small buildings. If you go to the next slide, you can see our goal, which is to cut the energy use in buildings 50% by 2050. Next slide, the first step that we've taken to do that is that we have a benchmarking ordinance in place, like many other cities. We publish all the data on a map at energizedenver.org for all the 3,000 buildings over 25,000 square feet. We tell them how much they could save if they cut their energy use by 30%. Next slide. You can see our goal here in 2030 is that we cut energy use by 30%. It's the green line on this chart. We also have a goal to cut energy use 10% by 2020. And unfortunately, even with benchmarking in place, our current trajectory is sort of off track from that, right? We are growing energy use. That's largely driven by growth in our building stock. We're growing at a rate of about 2% per year. That growth is making lots of things challenging. It's making solving climate change challenging. It's making the cost of housing and housing affordability challenging. And so, as others have said, equity is going to be front and central and is front and central in all of our work to solve climate change. I'll pause here and say we recently formed a climate action task force to look at how to meet all of our goals on climate change, including these buildings goals. And our Climate Action Task Force just finished their work. They will formally be announcing all of their recommendations later this month or very early July. We're finalizing the date. But I will flag for you, they looked at this data and they were diverse stakeholders from across our community. And they said, even with COVID, even with a pandemic, this means we need a building performance policy that requires buildings to start meeting these goals, because that will drive investment, that will drive jobs. Design the policy in a way that makes housing more affordable, that gives opportunities to people of color, First Nations, disadvantaged communities. But they leaned in and they said, do more. If you go to the next slide, you can see another one of our really tough goals, which is that we know all of our buildings and homes in Denver are heated with natural gas. If you go to the next slide, we know that they need to be moving towards all electric. Our formal goal is that 50% of the heating emission reductions have to be reduced by 2040. The task force moved that back to 2030 in their recommendations to us. If you go to the next animation, you see eventually we have to have them all off of natural gas. I will note, of course, this is one of the most challenging goals in buildings. We also recently, just this week, found out that in the state of Colorado, a group is working on a ballot initiative that would prohibit any restrictions on the use of natural gas in Colorado. So that is not yet on the ballot, but we are very concerned that that is working to get put on the ballot for this fall. So we're trying to figure out a plan to work on that. The next slide, you can see we're also writing a plan for how we will strategically electrify all of the existing buildings in Denver throughout the course of 2020. So please reach out if you want to be involved in that plan development. We'll have a lot of stakeholder input options, or if you just want to follow that process. I think that Connie can share all of our contact info if I don't have it on my last slide, because we are going to be doing a lot of planning for how we ambitiously start electrifying all of our homes, all of our buildings. The next slide shows you our new buildings and homes. And if you go to the graphic after that, you can see in 2050, 50% or 40% of our building stock will be new construction, depending on just how fast we grow. And Denver is growing really fast. So we know that these buildings, go to the next slide, need to be highly efficient. All electric, powered by 100% renewable electricity, providers of demand flexibility to the grid. If you go to the next slide, you can see what we've done. Go back one, I think. You can see what we've done in code so far. So the national IECC codes are in orange, and we follow those. Like many other jurisdictions, we are a home rule state, so Denver does adopt our own code. So in 2019, we adopted our own Denver Energy Code that, as you can see, is about 15% better than the 2018 IECC code. And then we also adopted our first ever voluntary Denver Green Code, which is about 10% better than that. And our plan is in 2021, the Denver Green Code will become base code, and we will adopt a new Denver Green Code. I want to mention that nationally, we need codes to keep advancing. Our 2019 Denver Energy Code was very similar to the 2021 IECC code. And we know that that 2021 IECC code is almost finalized right now, but some groups have appealed certain proposals in the new code. And so if any of you are involved in that code process, it's important to help support NBI in their defense of one of those final votes in the IECC 2021 code process. I know Denver took an active role in voting because we need national codes to keep up with us, so that we're not an island of net zero buildings, but the rest of the Denver metro region and Colorado and the rest of the country are advancing with us. So the technology keeps moving along. Next slide. We also have our green buildings ordinance. This is for all buildings over 25,000 square feet. It layers on top of base code. So they all have to do one of these options. They can do a green roof or green space on the site. They can do a combination of green space and solar or energy efficiency, or they can do a large solar array on site, or energy efficiency by itself. If they do energy efficiency by itself, they have to be 12% better than whatever our current base code is. So this is a flexible ordinance that came from a ballot initiative by Denver voters a couple of years ago. It was adapted from the original ballot initiative, and it starts to push all buildings to do a little bit beyond just our standard base code. So this really is helping us take steps forward in Denver because people are already pushing forward because of this ordinance. If you go to the next slide, we are also working on a net zero energy new building implementation plan that is under development through this fall. And so we will be writing up that whole plan for how we get to net zero energy buildings by 2035, or if we adopt our climate task force's goals, they want us to be there by 2030. And that will be an outcome-based code that is all electric, highly efficient, powered by 100% renewable electricity, and providers of demand flexibility on the grid. So how do we step to that over time? This plan will lay out all the details. Again, reach out if you want to learn more. And next slide, that's it for me for now. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. That was fantastic. We do have a few questions. I was going to have everybody turn on their camera, but I think that with the short amount of time on questions and the iffy technology happening today, we'll just pass through that so we don't have to fight with it. But we go ahead and submit any more questions you might have. Reminder, the session is being recorded. All registrants will receive an email tomorrow with links to the recording and slides for the session. We will fix Greg's slide that was all wonky there. So, questions. For all presenters, how are your plans addressing embodied carbon?
This is Greg. I can jump in on that. So we have added embodied carbon as a element in our roadmap. It's going to become more and more important once we start getting our arms around operational carbon. It becomes a higher and higher percentage of the total carbon produced by a project. And we have actually started implementing on a couple of our programs, particularly the Buildings of Excellence competition, this last phase that was due, submissions were due March 27th, I think. It did require everybody to address the embodied carbon element of the construction project. So we are actively getting involved in it. That was our last stakeholder engagement session. So hopefully we'll have some useful information in our roadmap, and then more and more emphasis on this field as we go forward.
This is Micah. I'll just add, in Vancouver, we are going to be bringing to our city council recommendations for reduction requirements, carbon intensity requirements for embodied carbon for new construction this fall. We currently require reporting of embodied carbon for our projects to go through rezoning. So that's the first stage, just to figure out what are the emissions levels at. What we've learned is that already, as we've reduced the carbon intensity of operations in new buildings, when you add up the total lifetime of those operation emissions, embodied carbon is about equal to the whole lifetime operational emissions. So it's really important that we do take action starting now, because those embodied emissions are occurring today. They're not occurring 20 or 30 or 40 years from now. They're occurring today. So we're going to be putting in place some policies, requirements to reduce those emissions starting this fall.
Was there another response?
Yeah, this is Cami. Just really quickly, I'd say it's early days still, in my view, for Metro Boston. I think there's a lot more learning and action that still needs to be done on it. I will say that communities have started thinking about it, and that a new proposal that was submitted to our Board of Building Regulations and Standards around a net zero stretch energy code called the EASY Code, Energy Zero Code, does have as one of its provisions the accounting for and reporting on embodied carbon. So I think we're still looking for ways to try to insert that into policies here, but it is beginning.
This is Katrina. The only thing I might add, it is still early days for us also. It is something we want to start working on. It's something our Climate Action Task Force is directing us to start working on. We know we want to do that by encouraging building reuse, by encouraging materials reuse, by encouraging building with low carbon materials. The one step we did take was in that 2019 building code update that we passed last year. It allowed timber structures up to 12 stories. I believe they were only allowed up to 5 stories previously. And so that's one small solution that we've put in place so far in code.
Excellent. Let's see here. Is there a space for renewable natural gas and decarbonization plans?
This is Katrina. I can continue on since I was just chatting. We see that natural gas will probably play a small role. We don't see a source for large enough volumes to meet all of our needs. So we see renewable natural gas probably filling gaps where things cannot be electrified. That's likely to largely be industrial processes. There may be a couple of, building types that are particularly hard to electrify that might need some of that limited resource. But predominantly in buildings, we see electrification as the path forward because they can be electrified with heat pumps very efficiently.
As Greg, I concur with that, Katrina. I'd say a couple of other, so it's about prioritization of a limited supply. I think generally everybody agrees that just not enough capacity to develop enough RNG to take the place of the existing natural gas infrastructure. But other potential priorities would be, in New York City, for example, we've got the Con Ed steam system. So if you have a central a district steam system, you might be able to convert that to using RNG. And also you need to think about, in some cases, backup systems for resiliency if the grid goes down after you've electrified. So potentially biofuels or RNG as a generator alternative to diesel.
Okay, if there aren't any more comments, we're just about out of time. I just wanted to mention we have a Getting to Zero resources hub that NBI manages with a collection of over 300 resources, open source for you to download and use. And I want to thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you, panelists. That was great. I will add a slide here to this deck with everybody's contact information, since there's so many feedback loops that you all are working with for stakeholders. I'll make sure that people can get a hold of our panelists. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you, panelists, and keep a lookout for more webinars in this series later in the fall. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, NBI.
Thank you everyone for attending. Thanks for having us.
Thanks all.